This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 298 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before talking about this week's 10 trends, I wanted to send a reminder so you guys don't forget to enter this week's Gridiron Pick'em contest over on FanDuel. Just pick all the games for this week's NFL slate, and if you do well and get them all right, you have a shot to win a piece of the $10,000 jackpot. To enter, head to FanDuel.com. Trend 1 this week is that Dallas Goedert has seen at least 69% of Philadelphia's snaps over the last 3 weeks, and he ranks 21st in tight end routes run over this time. And all the while, he's seen at least 10.7% of Philly's targets over this time, when he didn't hit that mark once during the first 3 weeks of the season when he wasn't always 100% healthy. I'm pretty into adding Dallas Goedert this week off the waiver wire, especially since so many teams need tight end help. Because not only is Goedert going to be just as good of a play as other tight end streamers, but he has upside if something were to happen to Zach Ertz. If Zach Ertz is hurt or if he's out, all of a sudden, Goedert's a fringe top 5 or 6 tight end. But given the fact that he's seeing usage and he's playing more, you should get him now before the production starts to match. Matthew Stafford has thrown it 15 or more air yards on almost 27% of his attempts this year. Only Patrick Mahomes is throwing it deep at a higher rate. And this has really benefited the team's passing attack, and specifically Kenny Golladay. Babytron has a really strong 27% target share this season, but his average depth of target is almost 2 yards higher versus last year. That's going to help the sustainability of his production. He has a higher chance for a bigger play. Over the last 5 years, quarterbacks have thrown a touchdown on every 161 passing yards. Based on that yardage to touchdown conversion, the quarterbacks who should have 3 or more touchdowns than they currently have this year are Jared Goff, Andy Dalton, Kyler Murray, Cam Newton, and Baker Mayfield. Mayfield is by far the worst on this list. He should have 4.3 more touchdowns than he currently has. The problem for Mayfield and the Browns is the schedule. Like I talked about on yesterday's 15 Transaction show, after the Browns bye this week, they get 4 straight tough matchups. So you could theoretically buy later rather than right now, which is why they were either a sell or a hold. I do think they'll bounce back in plus matchups later in the season, but if you're a struggling team right now, you can't trust this passing attack. They're more stashes than anything else. Trend 4 is that the Steelers are still awful against the slot. So far this year, and this is according to data compiled via Pro Football Focus, but so far this season, no team has allowed more slot targets, a higher percentage of targets to go to the slot, more slot receptions, yards, and touchdowns. On the flip side, no team has seen a lower percentage of targets go to the slot than Philadelphia. They've seen fewer than 18% of the targets against them go there versus Pittsburgh's 42%. So you can use that information accordingly when making your lineup decisions. No team has allowed a higher percentage of their receiving yards to go to wide receivers than the Carolina Panthers. Now, I partially wanted to include this particular trend this week because the Panthers have faced some really wide receiver heavy teams this year. They had the Rams in week 1 who like to feature their trio, then Tampa Bay twice who funnel targets to Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, and then Houston, Jacksonville, and Arizona who all target their wide receivers at a higher rate than the league average. So if you see Carolina as a cake matchup on paper moving forward for your wide receiver, give that some context. It's not as easy of a matchup as it probably appears. Trend 6 is that Melvin Gordon has a 20% success rate. That number is measured by looking at the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back, and that's according to NumberFire's expected points model. Essentially, just 20% of Gordon's rushes have been deemed successful. Among the 57 running backs who have had 20 or more carries this year, only Giovanni Bernard has a worse success rate. So things really haven't been going well for Melvin Gordon so far. Speaking of the Chargers and Melvin Gordon, over the last 2 weeks, they've run 140 offensive plays while trailing. For reference, the average number of plays while trailing in the NFL this year among all teams is 197. And 9 teams have run fewer than 140 plays while trailing all season long. But I bring this up because it's 2 games with Melvin Gordon active. Keenan Allen has a 14% target share over these 2 weeks. He had over a 30% share from weeks 1 through 4. They've targeted their running backs on 35% of their throws over these 2 games, when their season-long average before Gordon's return was 26%. So the question becomes, what the hell does this all mean? Well, I'd say one reason the running backs are seeing the target share that they're seeing over these 2 weeks is because the Chargers have faced the Broncos and the Steelers. Those are 2 teams who rank in the top 11 in quarterback pressure rate this year. That's forced Phillip Rivers to dump the ball off a little bit more. I do have some worry about Hunter Henry being back and how that's going to affect Keenan Allen. But what we've seen over the last 2 years from the Chargers is that the running backs are going to see a bigger hit in target share with Hunter Henry back than Keenan Allen will. So I expect that high running back share to dip over the coming weeks. That makes Austin Eckler and Melvin Gordon less attractive as fantasy options. The next trend really highlights how much the Packers need Davante Adams and how much they miss him. But it's that Davante Adams still leads the Packers in targets despite playing 4 of 6 games. Even fewer games than that technically. I mean, there was a point on Monday night where Aaron Rodgers' wide receivers were all undrafted players. When MVS went down, every single wideout that he was throwing to was undrafted. The Packers really need Davante Adams back. Over Robby Anderson's last 6 games with Sam Darnold, he's averaged 9 targets, 5.2 receptions, 80.7 yards, and 0.7 touchdowns per game. I know that I mentioned Jamison Crowder as a buy candidate on this week's 15 Transaction Show, and I stand by that because he's sort of the unsexy name in that offense. But if you can get Robby Anderson for cheap right now for whatever reason, he's not a bad get either. This last trend is that Kansas City has been by far the worst rush defense in football this year. Against running backs, they're allowing about 0.19 rushing net expected points per rush. Now, usually that number is negative because rushing is far less efficient than passing is. But they're also allowing a 54.2% success rate, or again, the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back. No other team is higher than 49%. This should really bode well for Denver's running backs on Thursday, and maybe, just maybe, Royce Freeman will finally regress positively in the touchdown column. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. And as always, if you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, and really anywhere, but if you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, do me a favor and leave a rating and review. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back in your ears tomorrow with the weekly matchup show.